Well, hey, friends, welcome to today's edition of the Encouraging Word podcast. I am your host, Pastor Dave Murphy from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church here in Gardendale, Alabama. Coming to you on a Saturday afternoon, big heavy duty football watching day. So after you're done watching football, catch out today's edition of the Encouraging Word. Watch it during halftime or in between games. But I hope you're having a great weekend. Didn't get to film yesterday, so we're doing it today. And today we're going to be looking at kind of the close of this longer section of James chapter 2 that we've been looking at on the topic of favoritism. So there's really kind of four parts to this series, if you will, in kind of a subsection of the book of James. It covers chapter 2, verse 1, all the way through chapter 2, verse 13. And so we're going to be looking at the last two verses. But so far, we've looked at, if you go back and you watch the first three videos, we looked at the question of why favoritism is something that goes against the teachings of Jesus. We looked at the rationale. We looked at three different rationales of why favoritism and walking with God just doesn't work together. We know that God has a heart for the poor. That cancels out favoritism. We know that there's implications to favoritism. And so anyway, there's these implications to favoritism where people are in a courtroom setting or in a spiritual setting. Favoritism doesn't work. And then finally, just in rationale number 3, James says this favoritism is a sin. It violates the law of love. And so today we're going to look at the answer to favoritism, which is in chapter 2, beginning at verse 12 and 13. Let's look at it together. Here we go. So speak and so act as those are to be judged under the law of liberty. Why? For judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy, but mercy triumphs over judgment. And so what James is doing here, this is some beautiful words, and I want you to really hold on to that last phrase, mercy triumphs over judgment. In this very end, James culminates the entire section of chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, by declaring that in the end, there will be a triumph of the gospel. James wants us to know how this reality is to be made known in the here and now through the speech and actions of those who are in Christ. We begin this section by hearing how not to speak and act. That is, don't show favoritism. Favoritism goes against the heart of God and what it means to love neighbor. Now we end with a positive response of what does faith really look like? And so here we go. How we speak and act should be guided by the fact that we are under what's called the law of liberty. That is, we are under Christ. Look at verse 12 again. It says, now speak and act, be a hearer and a doer. Speak in such a way that your speech reflects that of Christ. Act in such a way so that your actions reflect the way of Christ. Speak and act in this way as those who are to watch this, to be judged under the law of liberty. Now let's explain what that means to be judged under the law of liberty. James is emphasizing that our actions, our speaking, and our doing should be consistent with the emphasis on works that will follow in the next section. See, Christ has freed us from the Jewish, Mosaic, covenantal, 10 Commandment law. He has freed us from that, right? But there still is a day of judgment to come where everyone will be judged according to what they have done, both good and bad. Now, for those who are in Christ, Judgment Day, because people ask me all the time about Judgment Day. Judgment Day should never be feared by those who are in Christ. Why? Because God has kept the law perfectly on your behalf. God has taken all unrighteousness from you, removed it from you, and replaced it with his righteousness. He has made you to be a good tree, and now that good tree will produce good fruit so that you can speak and act in a way who is judged under what's called the law of liberty. And that word liberty is important, right? It implies freedom. So there's a law that brings freedom versus a law that brings condemnation. The 10 Commandments, the covenantal law that we see in the book of Exodus and fleshed out in the book of Leviticus, right? That's the royal law. That's the law that is the covenantal law that condemns us, right? But this law of liberty is much different, okay? It's a day not to be feared by those who are in Christ. Why? Because you and I will be judged, not by the Mosaic law, but by the law of liberty. God judges us according to the gospel, that is, the law that sets us free. We've been set free from the righteous demands of the law because Christ is the perfect law keeper. James now gives us clarity then on how we should speak and act. We should speak and act according to our new identity as those who have been born again, who have the word implanted in our hearts, who have been called out of darkness into wonderful light, who have the hope of liberty. James wants us to live as those who anticipate that they will soon experience the day of Christ's return and blessed judgment according to the law of freedom. So this speaking and acting, it's an ongoing, it's an habitual practice. In fact, James reminds us that we've been freed from the condemnation of sin. Hear that again. You've been freed from the condemnation of sin, including the sin of partiality, favoritism, ill judgment. We've been freed from a life of speaking and doing. We've been freed for a life of speaking and doing according to the reality of Christ, who will come again one day to judge the living and the dead. And it is a day that we do not have to fear. The law of freedom assures us of a blessed judgment. And so James exhorts them to live in that freedom. Then he says this in verse 13, and it's huge. He says, listen, for judgment is without mercy to him who shows no mercy. Now that phrase, that opening phrase, is basically a summary statement of the parable of the unmerciful servant. If you want to understand what James is saying here, go back, read the parable of the unmerciful servant, about the servant who the king showed incredible mercy to, forgave a debt that could never be paid back. And then once they were in their freedom, what did they do? Instead of showing mercy, instead of showing kindness, instead of extending grace, offering forgiveness, they turned around and demanded, judgment upon someone who shouldn't have been, who should have been shown mercy, right? This verse 13 begins with the word for judgment is without mercy to him who is shown no mercy. That for is what's called an explanation word. It's a causal word. It means this is why we're supposed to speak and act in a certain way. When Christ returns to those who pass judgment, those who have not shown mercy in this life, you're a hearer, but you're not a doer, right? You have faith, but you don't have works. You will be shown no mercy. And that's a terrible thing to think about, right? That's a really powerful statement. And we should take that statement seriously as Christians, right? Now, does that mean we do a force mercy, like we force ourselves to show mercy? No, that would be to violate the law of freedom. You know what we do? We go back to God, whose mercies are new every morning, and we allow the mercy of God to overflow our lives and our heart so that what we want to do is extend mercy to others. Now, in this description, James places showing partiality against the poor within the broader category of the sin of withholding mercy. This accords with Jesus' comment, "Blessed are the merciful, so they shall obtain mercy." Jesus taught us to pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who have had debt against us. For if you forgive men their trespasses, your Father in heaven will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men of their trespasses," which means you don't have mercy on people, "then neither will your Father forgive yours." Jesus rebuked the scribes and the Pharisees for tithing even their garden vegetables, but leaving the undone weightier matters of law, which includes justice, faith, and guess what? Mercy. In fact, he elevates mercy in this moment, Jesus does, to be part of the big three: faith, mercy, and justice. Now, what is mercy? I love this definition. Mercy is the application of grace. So God shows you his kindness, though you don't deserve it. That's grace. And then mercy, right, is when you show that kindness back towards others. Mercy is the conduit that conveys grace to the needy person. Mercy has a final word, right? See, if the sin of partiality is that we have an evil judgment, mercy overcomes that evil judgment. It, in fact, triumphs over judgment. And the best place where it triumphs is the cross of Jesus Christ. That's where mercy, true mercy, overcomes judgment. Jesus went to the cross because he was judged and found guilty and sentenced to death on a cross for me and you, even though he didn't deserve it. But God showed him great mercy on the cross as he suffered, died, bled, and was raised from the grave. That's where you find true mercy. That's the mercy that overcomes judgment. And that's the mercy that enables us to not show favoritism in this world, to pass evil judgments and distinctions, but rather to treat all men, all women, exactly how God intended. That we are all one in Christ through our baptism. That we love and serve our neighbor well. All right, friends, that's today's encouraging word. I hope you are blessed. I hope you're encouraged. Pass this message along. I think it's a wonderful message to be encouraged by. We love you, and we'll see you next week for the next edition of the Encouraging Word.